Good morning, and welcome to the Middle East Institute live webinar on deep environmental transformations in the Gulf Arab states, past, present, and future. I'm Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President here at MEI, and to discuss these issues that are perhaps among the most challenging issues that confront the Gulf states and the Persian Gulf as a whole. We have an outstanding cast of panelists to discuss these issues with us. Let me introduce Syed Asarmi, who is a meteorological expert working at the Secretariat General of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Syed builds and monitors collective strategies for GCC countries, weather, partnerships, and enhanced cooperation projects among the GCC countries. Naire Kolkaila is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford. Naira has spoken regularly at college campuses, interfaith events, and churches on issues related to Islam and women and living as a Muslim in the United States. And Laurent Lambert is a senior policy analyst at the Social and Economic, actually, he's not. He is at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Let me correct that. And is an assistant professor of water, energy, and climate in the School of Public Policy. So the issues that we want to discuss today involve the overall, the climate and environmental impacts that the Gulf countries are going to be facing. They include issues of sea level rise, temperature rise, the habitability of cities as we go forward. What are the overall health issues that are confronting the Gulf itself with the impacts of desalination, of algal blooms, of pollution, the impact on fisheries and other uses of the Gulf waters themselves. And most important, perhaps, is what is the potential for regional cooperation and coordination among the littoral states of the Gulf going forward? How are we going to address these challenges in the future? So let me begin, if I may, with Syed Asarmi, to ask him to give an overall assessment of the current situation in the Gulf, the impact of these climatic and environmental changes that we're going to confront.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Gerald, for your invitation, and welcome all to this webinar. To start with, I would like first to indicate that there is a consensus in the literature that the GCC region, the Arabian Peninsula as a whole, they are the impact of climate change has been, witnessed. The general pattern from the data from the meteorological stations located in the GCC countries shows that the warming is significant, and combining with this warming, there is drying and less precipitation is falling in the regions, and almost at least for the last 20 years, there is the most drought, condition has suffered or impacted the region so far. There are some good data in the region, but still relatively few in numbers. The stations in Oman, for example, we have data since 1942. In Bahrain, we have data since 1950, and in Kuwait since 1963. All the analysis of this data and the gridded gridded data coming from global meteorological research centers indicate that warming has already started to impact, and there is a climatological shift in the region. There is a different scenarios of the climate in the Arabian Peninsula. After 1998, there is a different scenarios of climate than before 1998. I don't know if it's possible to show one map, one figure. Can I show one? Is it possible to share a screen from my side?
Let's, Bargov, is it possible?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah. Can I show just one? You can see here
here we go.
these is it clear now? Is it, you can see the map?
Yes,
You can see the red line is the standardized time series for the whole meteorological stations in the region. Since 1998, there is a clear jump of temperature up to nearly 1 degree Celsius. And the blue line shows the precipitations anomalies, the annual ones, since 1998, which is below normal. In this region, whenever there is a wet period, you have, below normal temperatures. But as you can see clearly, that the precipitations have fallen down since 1998, and the temperature is going up. This is another literature shows the same thing, especially in summer and in spring. I will stop sharing now. The other issue in the region is there is a variation in the trend geographically. So north of 20 degree north, there is an increase of more in the mean maximum temperature, which is related more with the decrease of precipitation. But in the southern regions like Oman and Yemen, there is more increase in the minimum temperature, which is related to the increase of the sea surface temperature of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. One thing I would like to emphasize is the increase of impact of Category 4 and Category 5 tropical cyclones, which recently have increased and hit more Oman and Yemen region, which is really very severe and have so much impact socially and economically. And the climate models indicate that more intense tropical cyclones to hit the region in the future. Thank you so much. We cannot hear you.
indeed.
Yes.
There's a lot to follow up on your opening comments, and I wonder if I can turn to Naira, secondly, and ask for her thoughts on these issues. And now it's your turn to be on mute.
Yes, now hopefully you can hear me now. Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you for organizing this event around a very important and relevant topic. I actually wanted to start by addressing the major shift that has taken place actually in people's connection to the land and sea. So historically, the region actually had a more kind of nomadic lifestyle where, Bedouins lived in the desert, they were out in nature, in the open air, herding animals, where water was, still scarce, but people knew where to find it and how to protect it. Also, the economy and livelihood of the tribes settling on the coast, it depended on things like fishing, pearl diving, pearl trade. So not only was their ability to eat and live directly dependent on the integrity of their surroundings, but they were also kind of more immersed and physically connected to the natural environment. Now, after the discovery of oil and gas and the rapid industrialization that took place within, the span of one generation, more people began settling in the urban built environment. So they've become kind of physically and spatially disconnected from the flora and the fauna and the marine life. And their livelihood, which now mainly depends on revenues from fossil fuel exports, isn't really contingent on them being intimately connected with the natural environment and with their natural resources. And this has kind of numerous consequences. And one is we see somewhat of a generational difference between the older folks that experienced kind of extreme poverty, not so long ago, who generally knew how to live within their means and respected and kind of valued their sources of sustenance as a blessing. And then the younger generation that was kind of born into the built environment and didn't really experience direct contact with nature or directly rely on it to survive, and was also, born into extreme wealth in many cases, and who also doesn't really recall the lost habitats, mangroves, oases, et cetera, that Dr. Lambert will speak to. And as such, they're not, so much concerned with losing so much of their natural heritage because they didn't even know it existed to begin with. And so one of the issues that I wanted to address in addition to this kind of disconnect from nature is the fact that most people in the region, both young and old, who aren't environmental scientists, climate advocates, or experts who studied these issues in the US or Europe, are almost entirely unaware of the present environmental vulnerabilities of the region, whether it's the high temperatures or water scarcity or air pollution or sea level rise. That groundwater is rapidly depleting. Many of these countries depend almost entirely on the very energy intensive process of desalination, that food security is a very big environmental concern, that temperatures might make certain areas unbearable and, frankly, uninhabitable, that the severe air and water pollution in the region is endangering people's health and the marine environment. And also, the issue of sea level rise, that it is an imminent threat that can, submerge the coast, and it's very costly to mitigate, if not done through natural means, in which, some environmental scientists say may force governments to have to relocate their people in the not so distant future. There's also other issues related to, subsidies. So many people in the region will argue that water and energy subsidies are a big problem, because when, water and energy are free or heavily subsidized, and, some people, don't see their energy or water bills, these sources then are perceived as cheap or worthless. And so people don't value or respect them. And that's why you often hear of, people never turning off their lights, or people washing their cars, on a daily basis, and their pavements, kids turning on faucets indefinitely, nobody stopping them, or people showering for an hour, things like that. So there's a big disconnect between the environmental realities in the region and local people's behavior. I can go more into things related to food waste, and I just wanted to mention, though, that of course, Gulf countries are home to numerous nationalities and ethnicities, and people of different faiths, or even no faith, and of course, tapping into universal and shared values is really key to broader collaborative efforts. At the same time, I think there's a big opportunity here to draw on indigenous cultural and religious values in the region to create more sustainable cultural shifts in the way locals and nationals perceive environmental issues. And I think framing environmental issues in kind of a spiritual, ethical term can help promote, a higher level of environmental consciousness that really encourages people to not only live in alignment with their values, but, to become part of the effort to resolve environmental issues and mitigate climate change. And there's, other issues that I can mention related to eco-literacy for imams and things like that, but I'll stop here and let Dr. Lambert speak. I think you're on mute, Ambassador.
Thank you. And that is actually a great segue into Dr. Lambert and his presentation. And I know you want to talk a little bit about loss of biodiversity and air pollution issues, things that Naire also touched on. But you know, equally importantly, I think your insights, Dr. Lambert, into what popular attitudes are, and I think it's extremely interesting what Dr. Naire or Dr. Tabi Naire said about the generational differences. And in a sense, this is the reverse of what we're experiencing here in the West, where the younger generation seems to be much more attuned in many ways to the challenges of climate and environmental change than the older generations do, where people expected that natural resources would always be available and that climate would have little effect on their own lives. So would you please bring in your own comment and analysis?
Yes, so thank you very much again for this very interesting panel, and thanks very much also to Said and Naira for sharing their insights. I think it was very comprehensive, and so to answer to your question about the attitudes, what we have seen in the Gulf region where I'm located is that we have sort of complex attitudes towards the environment. On the one hand, the people would say, and they really mean it, that they love their environment, they consider it as a heritage, and they want to protect it. But at the same time, what sometimes does not really sound logical for us experts analyzing it is that at the same time we see behaviors which are very detrimental to the environment. Naira mentioned, you know, the heavy water and energy consumption, you know, the electricity staying on, you know, the water consumption per capita being almost equal in a country like Qatar, which is a desert country, to that of Canada, which has a lot of water resources. So things seems to be as if the people did not care. Although when you make surveys, national surveys, you actually find that people care about their environment. So there is a sort of disconnect between people's everyday behavior. And by the way, when I say people, I mean the local people, but also the foreigners who come to these countries. And we should say that there is a lot of foreigners in these countries. On the one hand, so the behavior, and on the other, their idea of, you know, we should care for the environment. Very often, the popular attitudes are that there should be places, sort of sanctuaries, where the environment should be protected. But what we realize is that the world's environment does not need to have just sanctuaries. It also needs to have people who on a daily basis will not have a huge consumption of electricity, which will generate air pollution, because to generate the electricity, especially in the Gulf region, we'll need either crude oil, as in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, they use a lot for power generation, or natural gas, which is less polluting, but still not a clean energy for the whole power generation. So there is a sort of disconnect, which is largely due also to the fact that, and Naira spoke about this, that the people don't really know necessarily that they're impacting by their behavior the environment. So environmental awareness needs to be really gaining momentum and fast. So now I just would like to complement what has been said by my colleagues and friends. And again, we're very lucky to have these experts today. I should say that, and to put things in perspective, we have in the Arabian Peninsula just a formidable, very rapid, fast-paced development which has happened after World War II. There is this notion in economy that some countries that are now called emerging economies sort of catch up for the many years, decades, sometimes centuries, during which they had not this rapid pace of development of the infrastructure, etc. And this catching up effect can really be seen in the Gulf countries. Sometimes people wonder, why is it that Qatar has the highest carbon footprint in the world, or second highest carbon footprint in the world, depending on the year? But the reason is that a country like Qatar or the UAE or Kuwait, to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia, are countries where during sometimes decades, they had not a fast-paced development, especially prior to World War II. There was almost no modernization of the built environment. So after World War II, things started to go to develop at a rather fast pace, especially in the 50s with the first oil export revenues. And then things completely boomed by the 1970s. And by the 1970s, we enter for the Arabian Peninsula into an era where we have a radical change. While the human footprint used to be very small, especially compared to other regions of the world, and also even compared to other developing countries, let's say in Latin America or in Southeast Asia, for instance. Now, by the 1970s, the human footprint becomes very big. We have fast-paced urban sprawl, the cities booming, literally. So, of course, we know about Dubai, but it's all across the region. It's also in Yemen. In Yemen, it's more driven by the local demographic growth, but in Dubai, in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, to a lesser extent Bahrain, we have not just the local demographic growth, but we have, when there is an oil boom, we have then an immigration boom. So many people will come from different countries. They will need to be housed. They will need also to have access to water, electricity. So we have all of a sudden, in a very short period of time, because it's very correlated to the oil boom period, we have a frenzy of an incredible number of investing in infrastructure development. So we've seen this pattern since World War II, accelerating by the 1970s, and in the 2000s also up to 2014, there was an incredible oil boom, which generated a lot of construction. I remember the first time coming in the Gulf, being shocked by the number of cranes that I could take in a single photo. I had never seen that before, although I had traveled as a geographer to quite a number of countries. So we have this very important oil and gas boom, economic boom, population, demographic boom again. And then this generates, as I've said, an urban sprawl. So the cities growing very fast, transforming the local environments, what used to be natural environment into, this completely artificialized environment. And just to say something about climate change, when we have the desert environment or the mangroves forests being changed into something artificialized, that means that concrete, asphalt, cement, everything that traps the heat is replacing the natural environment. And thus we have cities all across the Arabian peninsulas which are becoming generally, not always, but generally magnets for heat. There is a storage of heat, creating what is called as the urban heat island effect. And it slowly is being released at night, but that means generally that the nights are not really cooled as they used to be in the Arabian Peninsula, because there is all this heat coming from, the pavement, coming from the roads, etc. So this is a major issue. There are only a few cities like Abu Dhabi, which has made a lot of landscaping, which has managed to really cool down the temperatures. But even there, they have a huge problem of temperature increases, largely due to climate change, global climate change. Now, when it comes also to the artificialization of the landscapes, it's not just the cities, it's also all the coasts, which is prime real estate. So there, it's not just the land biodiversity which has been affected. A century ago, there used to be wild cats, big cats in the Arabian Peninsula. This is gone. Even the gazelles or the oryx, for instance, is now on the red list of the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So that means even these very emblematic animals are threatened. And so when the coasts are being artificialized for real estate purposes, well, then this is the marine biodiversity, which is also then affected. The mangroves forests, so the mangroves are sort of short forests which can live in what we would call extreme environments, not very many precipitations and very salty water. It's along the sea line, it's on the shore, but these environments thrive, and they enabled also the marine, the fisheries along the coast to thrive. But because these have been cut, and not just in the Gulf area, but also in the Red Sea, by the way, the problem is that we don't have this biodiversity thriving as it used to. At the same time, I shall say, climate change is affecting the corals, and affecting also even more in the Gulf than in the Red Sea, by the way. The corals here in the Gulf are bleaching, meaning really suffering from climate change, the increase, the warming of the temperature, and the acidification of the water that comes with the warming. And we have also the seaweeds, which is key elements in the coastal environment, which are being taken away, sometimes just because there is dredging, sometimes because of poor practices, poor development. But that means at the end of the day, on the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, from Kuwait, but even from Qasr in the south of Iraq, up to the north of the Sultanate of Oman, all this coast that includes, the big cities of Eastern Saudi Arabia, but also Qatar, the UAE cities like Abu Dhabi and Dubai, all this coast is very affected by coastal erosion and deterioration of the local environment on land, but also offshore. And the fisheries are really, really in a poor condition. So many of my colleagues are trying to call the authorities and to say, in an advisory manner, we should really work on that, because there are some tipping points we are afraid of, the thresholds where we would cross and then we could never come back, And so this is a big concern. I will not mention too many things. I just wanted also to mention the air pollution, because this is a serious problem. The World Health Organization has released some data a few months ago, actually. And for the whole of the Middle East, there is a big problem of the air pollution coming from power generation, but also transportation, so the automotives. But also from the natural environment, it's a very dusty and increasingly dusty environment. So what people don't realize is that because there are droughts in neighboring Iran across the Gulf, then these droughts in Iran are meaning that some lakes, for instance, are vanishing. And instead what you have is that you just have the bottom of the lakes and you just have the dust remaining. And so every time there is wind, it transports basically these tons and tons of dust across the Gulf, and they come here in the Arabian Peninsula. And so this increases this problem of air quality being at a very low level. Last but not least, there is one thing we don't really know is over time, what is the compounding effect of having this man-made pollution of power generation and industries, etc., plus the so-called natural aerosols or air pollution. We don't know their combined effects. We know the effect of one, we know the effect of the other. We don't know what's going on when the two are made together over a long period of time. So this is something we need to collectively think about, and for which I call for international cooperation for sure. So I will leave it here because I feel I have spoken a lot and I wouldn't like to monopolize the talk.
Thank you, Laurent. And let me follow up with you and fold in also a question that we have from one of our audience participants. Given the impact of the built environment, obviously of man's impact on the climate and the environment, what are the Gulf states doing? In other words, you mentioned Dubai. We could say the same thing about Doha, even about Riyadh or Kuwait. Less about Muscat, but in any event, that over these past 20 or 25 years, we've seen this huge increase in the built cities, glass and steel, depending on air conditioning. One of the issues, and I remember this when I was still at the State Department and John Kerry was negotiating with the GCC states to encourage them to sign on to the Paris Climate Accords against some reluctance on the part of the Gulf states. But one of the big concerns was the possibility of having to replace hydrofluorocarbons because of their pollution factor. And yet there is a big question about how these cities could survive with the loss of this critical component in air conditioning and cooling systems throughout. But even beyond that, the impact of these built cities on the climate, and is there any thinking that's going on about the need to actually change the architecture of cities in order to make these cities habitable going forward? And I'm going to come back to Saeed in a moment and ask him to predict the future for us a little bit on those issues. But to get to the question from the audience, it's what are the Gulf states doing in compliance with the Climate Action Plan, except for UAE and Oman that have established their national climate action plans. There is the concept of deep ecology as it applies to environmental sustainability, but not all countries have taken the National Climate Action Plan as a follow-up to the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So if you could comment on that.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the question. There are a number of things that the countries of the region are doing. They are not, unfortunately, working enough together, but I think it will improve in the forthcoming years. Obviously, over the past years, there used to be tensions in the Gulf, especially around Qatar, but now things have improved, so there should be more cooperation in the years ahead, hopefully. And I think climate change will be one of these key topics for which they have to work, because they see also the challenge in terms of reduced rainfalls and also more challenging food security. So this is something which is at the top of the agenda. Now, with regards to the specific action plans, we have different activities being undertaken by the different countries. So for instance, in Qatar, they have focused more in recent years on this sustainable urban development, precisely because it was booming so fast. They really realized that they had to make something much more sustainable in the future. So they focused on that. So they have, I wouldn't say pioneered, but they have to some extent a level of leadership in how to develop a more sustainable urban environment. However, the UAE, for instance, have a leadership really in terms of investigating sea level rise and what it can mean. They have a research center, for instance, in the New York University branch, which is located in Abu Dhabi, for instance. So what I would say is that we have different states which have provided different and complementary expertise so far. They need more to work together, and they need, and that's very important, not just to have it as a nice policy, but really to go and more rapidly on the implementation side of it. For now, this is what is to some extent the most missing, is to have a strong implementation of this body of policies, which is piling up, but which is not yet implemented fast enough, I would say, with regards to the big challenges of the environment that we can face today. Lastly, I would say the Paris Agreement on climate change has been signed and ratified by all the GCC member countries. They have provided their nationally determined contributions, at least the first one, generally around 2017. They need to release their, after 5 years, they need to release. So hopefully next year, we expect they will have all released their second commitments to the Paris Agreement on climate change, because every 5 years, they have to release a new commitment, which has to be more ambitious than the previous one. So we expect this to be all available by next year, hopefully. I think, and that's President Biden's leadership in terms of relaunching climate action with the recent leadership summit that we saw is a good thing, because it will show that there is momentum. It will show that no countries can stay aside, and that really it's the time to go for these bold plans, but also these bold actions that speak 1,000 words.
Thank you, Laurent. And Naire, coming back to you, you had talked about the interconnectivity of populations of states in the impacts of environment. We also have a question from the audience from Sina Winkle, who says, thanks a lot for this enlightening talk. I'm really curious, what do you think about the term planetary health, One Health? I found out that this term is not really on the agenda of a lot of countries in the region, but in the rest of the world. Do you think there will be a good chance to address the environmental health nexus better with approaches like planetary health to put the region more on a global, national, and regional level? What do you think will be the main challenges to implement planetary health diplomacy?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, planetary health is definitely something that's not addressed sufficiently. And, there's been talk of different kind of economic models like donut economics that considers, planetary boundaries, but at the same time, balancing between social needs and, the environmental needs and sustaining, the natural resources for people and future generations. There's talk also of circular economy where, people aren't just using things and then throwing them away, kind of challenging this throwaway culture that exists a lot. And so I think, planetary health is something that definitely needs to be balanced with people's needs. And there shouldn't be this conversation where it's always, if it's economic development, then we're not going to consider the environment. And, that if we're focusing on environmental sustainability, then we're not going to give people jobs and we're not going to focus on people's well-being. So there needs to be that balance between those needs. And, I think also I just wanted to touch back on something that Dr. Lambert mentioned related to the air pollution. Because there's also water pollution that's not always addressed too, and people don't realize that, the marine environment, it's something that's kind of considered out of sight, out of mind, and people don't realize that there's really numerous benefits to maintaining healthy marine ecosystems, also including, regulating land temperatures, extreme weather events like Dr. Sarmi mentioned, erosion and pollution control, preserving marine biodiversity, the fisheries, and of course, the recreational areas for people, which is important too. And we talk about, ecosystem-based management. It's considering people's needs and their access to the environment and places where they can enjoy themselves as well without disturbing the environment and creating an imbalance. And related to water pollution, this is something that the environmental scientists in the region are working on. And it's something because, again, it's kind of considered out of sight, out of mind, but when you look at the data that's coming from the environmental scientists, it's pretty alarming in terms of the kind of pollutants that are being found in the water related to hydrocarbons, radioactive material, heavy metals, trace metals, microplastics. And based on recent studies actually on species in the Gulf, the heavy metals and trace metals actually have been found to damage the genetic makeup of certain organisms, and this can affect their vitality. So, and this is species that were kind of already physiologically adapted to the extreme, hot and saline environment are now being pushed to their physiological limits. And so, with other factors like ocean acidification, these harmful toxins are being, present in the water. There's been, again, evidence of the coral bleaching that Dr. Lambert mentioned, the mass mortalities, even collapse of fish stocks, as well as migration of species away from the Gulf. And of course, for, sessile or mobile organisms like barnacles and sponges, if they're pushed to their physiological limits and they can't adapt and have nowhere to go, they can't escape, then of course there's going to be die-off. And then, other issues related to the overfishing, oil and gas leaks and spills, coastal development, the land reclamation projects. So, and these end up having numerous impacts also on, for example, disturbing habitats and species at the bottom of the ocean. So in terms of addressing many of these concerns, I definitely think we need more scientific research when it comes to the marine environment, mapping out these valuable habitats and areas that are rich in marine biodiversity. More research to understand how the species in the Gulf are affected by things like pollution and climate change. And we definitely need more of these protected, marine protected areas that reflect the scientific findings, and as well, like I said, ecosystem-based management that really helps balance between social needs and marine conservation. I think also, just to add to a point about environmental legislation and regulation. So, I think we need more of that across the region to reflect the current scientific data about the Gulf. So environmental laws and legislation exists, but it needs to be updated to reflect the current scientific data that is coming out of the region. And also for environmental impact assessments and law enforcement to come from independent entities who are not the polluters themselves. And so we also need whatever data environmental scientists and governments have to be made available to the public to increase broader awareness about the value and the necessity of preserving marine and terrestrial ecosystems.
I think that's great. And one of the things that we've been looking at a lot is the impact of desalination on the overall health of the Gulf. And as you know, going back to Saeed's initial slide, as we are in this period of prolonged drought, declining water resources throughout the region, increasing emphasis or reliance on desalination for providing people with their water needs, that is also having a huge impact on the overall health of the Gulf, increasing salinity, algal blooms, and other negative factors. And as you go through this, and as you put more brine back into the water and raise the salinity value, then in fact the efficiency and the effectiveness of desalination itself is reduced, so that the more you use that as your answer to water shortages, the less plausible, the less effective it's going to be over the coming years. And I want to come back to this question. I think that's critically important, and that is the issue of regional cooperation and coordination, which is going to be essential. But before we do that, I want to go back to Saeed again and ask for his assessment of what the trajectory is. We talked a little bit about the post-1998 period, but looking at it from a meteorological point of view, is this reversible? Is this containable? And of course, the secondary question to that is, again, what is the impact of these meteorological changes going to be on the survivability of these cities? What's going to happen to Dubai or Doha in the future if these changes aren't reversed? So, Saeed, your thoughts?
Yep. Yep. Thank you, Jerry. Just would like to say that what Laurent and Nerea indicate about their meteorological observations so far is really right. So more dust storms and sandstorms have been occurred during the last 5 or 10 years because of the drought. Very severe ones impacted Saudi Arabia and the rest of the countries because of the northerly winds coming from Iraq. So these become more severe and have really impacted the transportation, especially the aviation. There were some report of some incidents of some flights encounter such dust sandstorms while landing, but they couldn't make it, and they get back from the camp. So this is very, very dangerous, and it might affect the safety. The other thing Laurent has mentioned, the urban heating, because of the structures and the building. And it's clearly more relevant during the summer season. But at the same time, there were some studies in the region shows that some rural stations get warmed more than the urban ones. So it's not this climate change issue is really covering the whole spectrum, either the rural or the urban landscapes. Naira have really indicated or mentioned the level of awareness. This is really very, very important for the decision makers to be really aware of what is going on and can, take decisions towards making some appropriate actions and increase the awareness of the people to help and do something with the, to tackle the climate change impact in the region. The projections shows that more, if we continue as usual, and that's what actually shows, for the RCP 8.5, that the world is moving with the emission in these scenarios, which is business as usual. If this will happen, so temperatures will increase by the end of the centuries in the region, something between 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. And there is also a forecast that more humid air, more air mass of humidity coming from the Indian Ocean, where some of these meteorological cells, they call it the Hadley cells, is moving further north. So it's pushing more of moist air towards the southern Arabian Peninsula. So you get heat, more temperature, and more humidity, make it really very, very difficult in terms of health, and it will impact so much the people in the region. The extremes are really more heat waves is expected, and more extremes in terms of precipitation. So more urban floodings, more tropical cyclones in the future. And this is why it's not just Oman. Oman was a member of the panel of tropical cyclones in the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. Now, because of this concerns, Emirates and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, all of these countries have joined that panel so that they can, get more useful training and increase the early warning systems in their countries. Thank you.
Yes. If I may jump on
Yes,
this.
please, Laurent, and thank you, Saeed, but go ahead, Laurent.
Yes, thanks very much, Saeed. So about these extreme environmental events, especially severe storms or tropical cyclones, it's very important to note, in addition to what Saeed has said, that over the past 10 years, there has been really a larger number of tropical cyclones basically coming from what is the west of India, so the north of Indian Ocean, and then coming sort of south of Iran, crossing the Gulf, and then, not the Gulf north, but just going west and then affecting Oman. So this has existed for a long time, but now it's more severe, but affecting Yemen. And in 2018, in 2019, we have seen a series of tropical cyclones. And in 1 year, there were 3 very severe storms, very severe tropical storms. So that means that in a country like Yemen, which is also affected by war, we have an increase in these extreme environmental events, which are really devastating the built environment, especially in the south of the country. One of these storms was so devastating and so huge, so powerful, it went to devastate also a part of Somalia. It was the worst tropical cyclone Somalia a few years ago had ever recorded in its history, and it went as far as Djibouti. So it crossed the Gulf of Aden, something we had not seen in meteorological history since 1966. So we are really facing an increase in the number, and an increase in the force or the power of these extreme environmental events, which I think is very concerning. But at the same time, I believe, and this is why I wanted to speak right after Said, may generate an awareness at the level of the decision makers. Because what we've seen with Cyclone Gonu, it was in 2007, if I'm not mistaken, is that we had one of these cyclones which really destroyed parts of Oman. So there was damage for probably over 50 billion US dollar, if I remember the figures correctly. It killed many people, but it went up to the UAE. The UAE used to be seen as a sort of a safe place, you know. It was sort of protected by the mountains of Oman, etc. And the cyclones used to die because when they encounter the land area, they tend to die. But in this case, it went up to the UAE. So these kind of events, the multiplication of them, is more likely to generate awareness that there should be cooperation, because we cannot have early warning systems, by the way, if we don't have regional cooperation. The exchange of this information about, yes, it's coming, this is, the winds are at this speed, and this is coming as far as we can see towards also your border. And this is very important. And I'm thinking that on the one hand, it's true that for almost an hour, we've been painting a very gloomy, almost dystopian picture of the region. But I also would like to say that probably there is, and I can see it even with my students, the beginning of awareness that, wow, things are changing. You know, I can also see when I talk with people that they realize that the seasons are changing, that it's hotter, and that these extreme environmental events we've spoken about are things which are of concern also about, you know, for the authorities. Even if the authorities did not care about the environment, at least the authorities care about, let's say, power generation that they have to keep on increasing because of the hottest summer, right? They also care about water, because when you don't have rainfalls, well, underground, your water table is depleted, and then you cannot keep on having the same kind of agriculture as you used to have. So it's again affecting the security of the people, the water security, the food security, and the general public security and safety due to these extreme environmental events. So on the one hand, yes, big challenges, but also increasingly we see forms of opportunities of cooperation. So this is the kind of things we really support.
Thank you, Laurent, and I think that that's a good segue into what I'd like to spend. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left. I'd like to spend time with each of you talking about the prospects for regional cooperation. I do want to mention one factoid in relation to your comments about air pollution and dust storms. I was in Sana'a from 2010 to 2013. And as I'm sure you all know, Sana'a historically has been quite famous for the very high quality of its air, very clear, very, a few clouds. And for a long time, it was considered that dust storms couldn't reach Sana'a because of the altitude, that it's about 3,000 meters, or 2,500 meters, that the dust couldn't get up that high. And yet, by the time that I left there in 2013, we were in fact getting dust storms in Sana'a. And so I think that's indicative of how serious and how fast that phenomenon is affecting the entire Arabian Peninsula. But I want to come back and I want to finish the conversation with each of you with your ideas about regional cooperation, because we've talked an awful lot, and a number of our audience are interested in the same thing, that we've talked a lot about what individual countries are doing in order to address their own, unique set of circumstances. There have been some efforts in the past. There was RopeMe, which brought together all of the littoral states of the Gulf in an effort to cooperate and coordinate on environmental issues. That seems to be dormant at the moment. But this is a situation that, each of the states that borders on the Gulf has a vested interest in addressing. It is an issue that one would think would be a natural area, even in the situation of strained political relations, where each state would see a vested interest in cooperating and coordinating with its neighbors on trying to address some of these issues. But even within the GCC, I think that there's not a lot of evidence of coordination yet among the GCC states in trying to mitigate the impact of climate and environmental change. So if I could ask each of you in turn to talk a little bit about your own perspective and your own thoughts about whether or not we're about to see greater regional cooperation. And let's start with Saeed.
Thank you, Gerald. I think I agree with what Naira has mentioned before, and Laurent. It's very important to focus more on doing more research, and doing more science, and getting more results to prove that there is an impact of climate change in the region. This might help in changing the mentality of the decision makers, and let them help and focus more in doing more work to look into the climate change issue. And the other thing is to raise the capacity building of the people in doing more analysis related to climate change. It's very known that the region, the Arabian Peninsula, has environmental issue. A lot of the region is desert, empty quarter. So it's a harsh region, harsh area to, for example, implement and establish meteorological stations in that region. But what we can do is to be able to make use of the satellite data, the meteorological satellite data, which is available since 1970s. So if we raise more capabilities, human resources, to be able to grasp the data from satellite and do more analysis and show the evidence of the climate change to the public and to the decision makers. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed. Naire?
Yes. So, I mean, I think as Dr. Salmi mentioned, that we need more research, and I think we have a lot of academic and environmental institutions that are dedicated to environmental and climate research in the region and renewable energy potential, particularly solar. We haven't talked much about that, but although I think we need more of that research, people in the region also want that research that already exists to translate into changing policies and, changes on the ground. So I think we also need to raise the level of environmental consciousness, not just awareness about environmental issues and vulnerability, the vulnerabilities in the region, and using as many platforms as possible. So social media too is, from what I understand, really big, in the region in terms of Instagram is very, common for young people in the region to use. So I think that's something important to tap into, maybe TikTok as well now. And, also through religious sermons throughout the region too. I think that's something we haven't really talked much about, but in terms of people wanting that these are Arab and Muslim countries, and I think that it's arguably a great opportunity for imams to address environmental issues. We're not really at the point yet where imams and Muslim leaders in the region are addressing environmental concerns sufficiently. Some might think there are other priorities to address related to humanitarian crises in neighboring countries and struggling for basic human rights in the region, and this is definitely true. But I think environmental issues also need to become a priority, because in the long run, it's an issue of survival and intergenerational justice in the region. So yes, people want to hear, religious leaders speaking about Muslims' responsibility towards the environment, value of biodiversity from an Islamic perspective, how we can preserve the harmony and balance in God's creation, things like that, adopting more moderate lifestyles that can alleviate the pressure on natural resources and ecosystems in the region and globally. And I think people really want to have these deeper conversations around the ethical dimensions of environmental problems related to consumption, lifestyle, dependence on fossil fuels, the desire to accumulate kind of wealth and power that often leads to the devastation of the environment and threatens the health and lives of local populations and people in poor countries. And I also want to just mention one last point, that these environmental problems are very, very complex, requiring complex solutions. And so it's really important to pool the skills and talents and ideas in the region. In terms of more collaborative efforts, it can't just be between industry and government, but between, academics, scientists, activists, environmental planners, religious leaders, like I mentioned, ethicists, policymakers, who can come together and discuss, complex environmental problems and work together to contribute kind of meaningful and long-lasting solutions.
Thank you, Naire. And Laurent, the last word goes to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I agree with my two colleagues that we need to have more research being done. This is, of course, what you can expect to hear from an academic. But at the same time, I shall say that every time there is a new research on climate change, which is likely to affect the Middle East, it's in the news and it's everywhere. So the population, that means the population is willing to learn more about it, because if the population was not clicking on it, the newspaper would have stopped publishing it. So that means we have a population which is interested in learning more, and we can use that and to create this momentum. For now, decision makers see that priorities are to create new jobs. We have a youth, and we need to create jobs. We need to launch the economic engine again, etc. So this is the priority of the time. What we should be probably calling more for, we scientists, is these series of projects which can enable a sort of more green recovery, if I may say, although this needs a lot of work because in the word recovery in itself, as many have said, well, there is the idea of going back to something, previous. So it was not really green before. So we need to think, social scientists, environmental scientists, on what the future of the Gulf needs to be, and what the Arabian Peninsula, but also with our Iranian and Iraqi neighbors, we want to see. And I think there are a bunch of elements we can already map out. First, energy cooperation. As long as we don't have energy security in Iraq, what will happen is that people will turn off diesel engines and diesel generators to produce electricity once they have no electricity. Sharing the spare capacity of the Gulf state by increasing the network, the grid of the GCC, will enable the Iraqis to have more security, to spend less on polluting fuels. So this is the kind of cooperation we would like to see moving forward. The same can be true about some other forms of energy. You would prefer to have natural gas instead of oil being burnt to generate electricity. And of course, to have much more renewables being used. So about this, we can see some progresses, we can see some big projects, but we need to have this as a main form of energy generation coming online. And this requires cooperation, because to be able to calculate, very profitable solar energy industry and to put it online, you need to be able to have a regional market, to have a whole Arabian Peninsula being able to buy. At some moments, there will be a lot of sun in this country and another might need it. If the surplus can be traded, that's all the best for the renewable energy industry. So we need to have more energy cooperation, more trade on that aspect. And at the same time, and this is very important, we need to have more cooperations between the governments to find these urban policies, these construction policies that are adapted for the region. For too many decades, the so-called best international practices came from Europe or America, etc. Really good for moderate climates, not necessarily always adapted for these environments. So that doesn't mean technologies from Europe or the US or Japan is not relevant. It can, but we need to have also collaborations to see what has worked best in the UAE, and it can be implemented in Qatar, and the same in Qatar can be implemented in Saudi Arabia. And for this, we need to have more of us researchers to be able to work together and to feed policymakers disregarding the country we're in. And so for that, I'm very happy that there has been a thawing tie between and among the countries of the GCC, and I really look forward to going to my next conferences in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Oman, of course, and across the GCC region to be able to share and learn a lot from my colleagues. I think this is the kind of collaboration we look forward to having.
Great. Thank you, Laurent. And that is the last word. I did want to mention our friend Helen Lochner has asked if you have studies or articles that you can point to that would help further inform and advance the conversation. If you wanted to share those with us, we'd be happy to post them on our website so that people would have resources to call on. But I want to thank all three of our panelists, Saida Sarami, Naire Kokale, and Laurent Lambert, for their excellent presentations and for their participation in this discussion this morning. For some of our participants, it's quite late in the day. For others, it's quite early in the day. So we appreciate that. But most of all, I'd like to thank you, our audience, for joining us this morning. We look forward to further opportunities to discuss this issue, which is going to be a critical issue going forward for all of the states in the region. So thank you very much. Until next time,